Well, thanks, Julie, for the background information. I think that puts a lot of, not only about the politics in Georgia, but also a general overview of this, about the South Caucasus. Just a note, we were just talking earlier, last time Julie and I were in a conversation about the South Caucasus was 11 years ago, and in West Virginia, out of all places.
This is much better.
Yeah, exactly. So, a bit about my work. I've been working on the South Caucasus for the last 12, 13, well, actually last 16 years now. My work initially started looking at how small and new countries conduct foreign policy, and I was looking specifically at the cases of Georgia and Armenia. I did my dissertation research there. In the last 5 years, 6 years, I've been focusing more on civil society, the phenomenon of civil society in the South Caucasus, but also regionally. My area of specialization fluctuates between the southern tier of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and the Middle East. So I've also looked into civil society movements in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, in Israel, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Egypt. So there is a lot of comparison and a lot of interesting comparisons to make there. So what I'm going to try to do today is basically look at what the concept of civil society is, and basically moving on from there, I will touch briefly on the phenomenon of color revolutions that were so big and so popular and sort of forgotten now. And also basically try to see how does the changing political dimension in the landscape has an impacts civil society movements in these countries. So basically, a basic definition, and one of the definitions that I've used in the box below is London School of Economics Civil Society, Center for Civil Society, which incidentally, one of former Libyan dictator's son, Gaddafi, got his PhD from, and there was a lot of debate about whether or not he bought it or not, the degree. But he wrote his degree on, or his master's thesis on civil society in Libya. But the important thing about a civil society is that it is a group of citizens who have a shared interest. They do not have any political affiliation necessarily, or they might have multiple political affiliations, and they work together outside of state institutions, within the parameters of the state. This is not a revolution, but within the parameters of the state, but they would be pushing the boundaries of law and legal dimensions, which are some more often than not they're not conducive of any kind of a political action, citizens' action. It is an aspect of advocacy, and it could take any forms. It could be environment, it could be a specific issue of price hiking, and so on and so forth. So there are many dimensions of civil society activism. One important thing, in 2011, I was in Georgia and Armenia doing research, and most of this presentation is based on that research. One of the important things to keep in mind is that democracy and civil society are not mutually inclusive. At least from my perspective, the theory that I put forward, and it seems that more or less it holds true in the case of the South Caucasus, is that actually civil society thrives more in non-democratic systems. And the whole concept here is that when you have a democracy, a functioning democracy, and there are so many of those, but a functioning democracy, the state provides whatever the society needs. But when it doesn't, then that's when civil society is activated. They try to find ways to achieve those goals, or try to find ways to get what they need. They try to fill in the gaps. And actually, very interestingly, as a comparison, when they're trying to fill in the gaps, means that basic services, health services, garbage collection sometimes, when the state is not providing those, you would end up seeing groups which actually either collectively or in association with other civil society groups, they end up providing those services. In the news now, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, or Hamas, for instance, in Gaza, in Gaza and the West Bank, less so. For instance, putting aside their militant activities, their terrorist activities, I would like to think of them as civil society groups, because on the ground, they do provide services to their population. Health services, they would have free clinics. education services, and so on. So it is truly filling in the void, filling in the gap that an sort of representative democracy or non-functioning democracy leaves. In this context, so far I haven't talked about the South Caucasus, but getting there, have patience. Within this context, one of the most important phenomena that we witnessed in the last decade or so is the phenomenon of color revolution. Mostly, the concept of color revolution, when we look at it, is nonviolent protest or relatively nonviolent protest, or with a minimal amount of casualties. A group of people, mostly young people, advocating for political and regime change in their respective countries, and more importantly, they are not affiliated, or originally these groups are not affiliated with any political party. Very interesting, there's a very interesting documentary called Democratic Revolutionary Handbook, which looks into the different color revolutions, including in Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, where the initial the precipitation of these movements, and which eventually led to government changes in their respective countries, were basically young individuals who even refused to cooperate with opposition political parties, sometimes arguing that you yourselves are part of the problem. We're not here just to change the government, we are here to change a regime and the way of life. And even more importantly, and this is again highlighted in that documentary, but these revolutions, when we tend to think about revolutions, you think that it's spontaneous, but they're not. You know, it takes a lot of planning. And most of these color revolutions, they ended up coming up with clever marketing strategies. Short, basically, clips, advertising, very interesting logos and catchphrases. For instance, in Serbia, Otpor, which means resistance. The Georgian one actually was copied from the Serbian one, and they trained each other. That's the fascinating thing. It's a domino effect. The Georgian one, Kamara, which means enough. The Ukrainian revolution, Pora, which means it's time, it's now. So all of these movements ended up creating a change of regime. In Serbia, they got rid of Milosevic. In Georgia, they got rid of Shevardnadze and brought in Saakashvili to power. In Ukraine, Ukraine is, by the way, very interesting that the Orange Revolution was against Yanukovych. And the recent revolution was also against Yanukovych. I mean, the guy probably is going to go down in history as the person who in less than a decade had 2 revolutions that ousted him. Not something to be proud of, but something to think of. In parentheses, I also would like to mention that there is a hyped up, there was, and to some extent, there is a hyped up there is a hype about these color revolutions as this something idealist. Yes, they did manage to change. However, more often than not, you go back to Serbia, you go back to Georgia, there is also a level of discontent and disappointment about these. I can talk about, I can't talk about all 3, but focusing on the South Caucasus, in the case of Georgia, however, one thing is that over the years, since the Rose Revolution, in the last 8-9 years, actually, there has been an increase in citizens' trust in the state, not the government, in the state. There have been a lot of changes, a lot of transparency, less corruption, and when I was in Georgia doing this research in 2011, I have been there since then, but in 2011 I was talking with individuals, with people, and they were happy. There was an element of content, let's not say happy. There was an element of content. Yes, we still don't have jobs. Yes, there's still unemployment and inflation and so on and so forth, but there is hope for the future. There is less of government presence in our lives, or at least trying to make our lives difficult. I would like to now focus on each state quickly, highlighting this whole civil society phenomenon in each country. In the case of Armenia, and looking at different reports, the 3 different countries of the South Caucasus have had different sort of rankings in terms of what are they, semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian, very authoritarian, semi-free, largely free, and so on. Armenia would fall somewhere in the middle. While there has been a monopoly or perhaps hegemony of power, especially at government level, succession of presidents and parliamentary elections, the government has not been very intrusive of rights. especially when it comes to demonstrations, for instance, which is a very important aspect in kickstarting civil society movements and revolution. Yes, they do have laws that limit political activism and political participation, but more often than not, they haven't been very restrictive. And in the case of Armenia, as it was in Georgia and in Azerbaijan, but also in the former Soviet Union, some of the initial civil society groups started out as environmental groups, civil society groups about the environment. Actually, some of the early dissident movements in the Soviet Union were environmental groups. Perhaps possibly because it was less politicized, less political, but also it was an existential issue. You're getting sick. Your environment is being harmed. Sometimes, your national monuments are being destroyed because of development and so on. So in Armenia, that was one of the initial pushes for civil society development. And it wasn't until 2008 where there was a hotly debated, contested, and bloody presidential elections in 2008, that civil society started actually developing tremendously, exponentially. It was around that time that they found most of the different civil society groups in different issues: women's rights, advocacy, citizens initiative groups, environment groups, issues about or civil society groups which advocated for the rights of taxi drivers. All of these actually were managed to be mobilized somehow, or managed to be electrified somehow. And it's that point in 2008 that you can see an increase in civil society activism, perhaps also about reporting a relatively free media, which is advocated and which is also publicized among the people. And since 2012, after the presidential elections, parliamentary elections, and then presidential elections, this has gone to a higher level. In recent year or so, there have been at least 5-6 major civil society movements. One, for instance, was about the greenification or the demolition of a park, very similar to what happened in Turkey, for instance, in Gezi Park, where the government was thinking of coming up with a development plan. And young groups, young civil society groups, not affiliated with any political parties, if anything, actually very anti-political parties, they managed to stop that demolition. Or at some point there was a 50% hike in marshutka prices. Marshutkas are the minivans that work on several specified routes. So there was a 50% hike, which was overall the price was something about 150 dirham, local currency, Armenian currency, which is less than 50 cents. But it was a major trigger that led people to demonstrate, and they overturned the hike. Azerbaijan brings a different story. In Azerbaijan, after the color revolutions that had occurred in Ukraine and Georgia, especially after Ukraine, there was an attempt in the 2003 elections to do something similar. But as revolutionaries learn from each other, so do governments. And that's one of the things about the attempted revolution in Azerbaijan in 2003. They didn't get any funding from international donors. That was very, very crucial. And civil society groups cannot thrive, they cannot exist without aid, without financial aid. Ukraine, Georgia, they received a lot of aid. Azerbaijan did not. Actually, one of the major groups at the time within Azerbaijan was a group called Nagam, which basically, copied almost to the smallest detail about the symbols and colors of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. But the government knew how to deal with it. They didn't allow any gatherings. They didn't allow the people, the demonstrators, to have a critical mass in the city centers, especially in Baku, and that failed. Since then, the track record of the Azerbaijani government of Ilham Aliyev has been pretty much consistent. And consistency doesn't always mean good. Consistently sort of oppressive. In the last 4 or 5 years, although there has been a ban or arresting of people who would post on Facebook, especially active Facebook groups, there has been quite an activism in cyberspace. Not so much physically, because again, the government, it's much easier to control the physical space than the cyberspace. But one of the more recent groups is NIDA, which as the logo suggests, it means exclamation. It's a group that's very small, relatively speaking, a civil society group, about 350, 400 people, but very large presence online. Their activists are constantly sort of harassed for various, various charges are brought against them, not necessarily true charges, but they are. And perhaps one of the things I love about examining these civil society groups is, again, their marketing strategies. The logo or the motto of the NIDA movement is "Gelirik, we're coming." So basically, embrace yourself. It needs marketing. Marketing is very, very important in these civil society groups. And perhaps nowhere it is more determined or more apparent than in Georgia. Actually, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and Georgia actually had civil society movements even before the Rose Revolution. That was one of the, perhaps one of the advantages that Georgia had, especially in terms of media. There was a channel called Rustavi 2, which was very anti-Shevardnadze, anti-government, not so much as anti, but they would basically talk about corruption. They would talk about, the bad governance in the country. And the government decided to close it down. And that actually triggered a movement. That actually triggered the whole revolution, Rose Revolution in Georgia. One thing about these color revolutions, it seems that the process is that these young groups, civil society groups, young activists would come in, make the changes, and then they would be either pushed aside or they would step aside. And that's when the opposition would come in and take over. That's what happened in Ukraine, that's what happened in Georgia as well. Now, here's a question, here's a pickle, sort of interesting correlation between democracy and civil society, is that once the government changed in Georgia, once they started becoming more open under Saakashvili, they started implementing a lot of reforms, a lot of openness, transparency. Civil society seemed to have died out for two major reasons. One is that the funding that civil society was receiving before the Rose Revolution now was diverted to the government, because the ideals that the civil society was advocating was already picked up by the government. So more money was going there, so funding dried out. And the second thing, again, because the same things that the civil society groups were advocating now was being pioneered, or the banner was carried out by the government. So a lot of people, young people who actually before the revolution would go join different NGOs, because it had a higher pay, but also because of idealism, now the government was providing them. So all these groups, potential demonstrators or potential activists, were actually appropriated into the government, which was a good thing, because the government itself was carrying out some of these changes. That changed. In one of the interviews I had in Georgia with a civil society group member, I was talking, so I asked him point blank, is civil society dying in Georgia? Is civil society dying? It's already dead. It was a very ominous sort of response, but luckily, unfortunately or luckily, the 2008 war with Russia, which witnessed the independence, as Julie mentioned, the independence of Abkhazia and Ossetia, that actually became a lifeline for civil society groups, because international aid, $1 billion in aid, of which $200 million was earmarked for civil society groups. And since then, actually, civil society has been reviving, not in terms of more advocacy, but more in terms of watchdog groups. One example, for instance, there is an association called Georgian Young Lawyers Association. And the difference between civil society and a watchdog group is there to observe and report, not so much as advocacy in terms of participating and making changes. However, you're there and you're basically making sure that the government is under the spotlight so that they won't do anything that they shouldn't be doing. So that's what happened in Georgia as well. And as I mentioned earlier, since the Rose Revolution, especially after 2008, when the weight of the separatist groups or separatist regions, I think, and to some extent, we can have a discussion about this, but to some extent, the loss of Abkhazia and South Ossetia was a weight that was taken off Georgia's shoulder. That is not the major issue anymore, and the governments had to focus more, or they had no excuse not to focus on economic and social issues. So that was the situation in Georgia. Concluding, the relationship, if you look at democracy versus civil society activism, well, in the case of Armenia, because it has a semi-democratic, semi-authoritarian regime, it seems that civil society has been thriving. Again, the government has a tough hand or a heavy hand on overall any major political activism, but they do not stop people from demonstrating. They do not crack down on people who use Facebook. So a balanced sort of authoritarian regime, while it pushes people to become more active, the fact that it is not extremely authoritarian, it allows them to thrive. So there's the push, there's the trigger, and because of authoritarianism. But because the authoritarian hand is not heavy, they are able to thrive. Not the case in Azerbaijan. Again, the authoritarian rule of Aliyev regime, for instance, is the trigger that pushes Azerbaijan and different civil society groups to be active. However, that hand, that authoritarian hand is very heavy, which doesn't allow it to blossom as it would do in other cases, although the foundation is there. If rules are relaxed in Azerbaijan, there would be a boom in civil society, no pun intended. In the case of Georgia, it has been up and down. Again, very active under Shevardnadze, very extremely thriving, extremely active civil society groups under Shevardnadze's authoritarian, semi-authoritarian rule. During Saakashvili's early years, it basically started dying out, but after the war in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and also because of the discontent with the ruling government, Saakashvili's regime, civil society groups thrive again. So that correlation, I think, in the case of South Caucasus, where democracy does not necessarily help civil society. Actually, civil society pushes for democracy. It's basically they feed into each other with a slight, like you open up a window of a democracy, a slight window of democracy, and civil society can widen that window. And finally, why talk about all of this? Why is civil society even important in this case? Well, we have to keep in mind, it is, it's not everything. It's not going to fix all the problems of these countries. That's definitely not going to happen. It's not a substitute for government. Actually, it diminishes the value of the state. People, if there is no government or state that provides services and they're relying on civil society groups to provide those services to defend their right, people would lose their trust. They would lose their faith in the state. Perhaps that might be some correlation to see how that is translated along electoral processes. However, civil society is a very important also branch of government. I would consider it a branch of government, the fifth branch of government. The fourth usually is considered to be media, depending on which country you are. But I truly believe civil society can act as that fifth branch of government to check and balance government and other branches, the activities of other branches. And also, the most important thing is accountability. People, mostly because of the fact that they have lived under Soviet control, there is a lack of accountability in former Soviet space. It is very much apparent in what happened with Shevardnadze, with Yanukovych in Ukraine, in the case of Azerbaijan, in the case of Armenia with the current and the previous presidents. And civil society actually is that voice that keeps the glass ceiling from not lowering, not coming down further. Civil society keeps pushing it up, and that actually provides space in which the discourse or the conversation and the constant reminder that you are accountable to the people is maintained. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker today will be Dr. Andrew Hess, who joins us from the Fletcher School, who will be speaking on the energy geopolitics of the Southern Caucasus.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to use the computer if I can figure out where we're going to.